Com a morte de Osama Bin Laden, qual será o destino da Al-Qaeda? Qual é a força real da organização? Onde é que ela de fato existe e atua? Podemos esperar novos atentados com a dimensão dos de 11 de setembro? Como foi que a Arábia Saudita, de onde saíram muitos dos integrantes da Al-Qaeda, conseguiu extirpar a organização? Estas são algumas das perguntas respondidas neste milênio pelo professor de estudos islâmicos da Universidade de Princeton, Bernard Haykel. Nascido no Líbano, Haykel fez seus estudos na Arábia Saudita, onde tem acesso à família real e aos segredos de Estado. Nos últimos 10 anos, Haykel se dedica diariamente a monitorar os sites ligados à Al-Qaeda na internet, o que lhe permite ter informações de primeira mão sobre a rede terrorista, que mesmo após a morte de Bin Laden, continua a ser o inimigo número 1 dos Estados Unidos.
You always listen to what Al-Qaeda is saying through their websites, you're always following them.
Yes.
What are they saying now that Bin Laden is dead?
After Bin Laden's death, there was a huge amount of memorialization of the man. You know, a lot of poetry was produced, many texts were produced commemorating him, declaring him, you know, a martyr. And then there was silence for a while, and there was a question as to who would replace him in the command of Al-Qaeda. And I think there is a conflict within Al-Qaeda between different factions. And the faction that appears to have won is the one led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, who has since been declared Al-Qaeda's leader and the successor to Bin Laden. The problem with Ayman al-Zawahiri is that unlike Bin Laden, he has very little charisma. He is a very divisive figure in terms of leadership style. And so there's a question mark as to Al-Qaeda Central, what we call Al-Qaeda Central, the core leadership group that is based on the frontier between Afghanistan and Pakistan, what role they will play in the future of the movement.
But besides this Al-Qaeda Central, there is also a network of people that belong to Al-Qaeda somehow, associated with Al-Qaeda elsewhere.
Yes, definitely. I mean, Al-Qaeda has affiliates or franchises in a number of places. In Yemen, in North Africa, West Africa, North Africa. It has a group in Iraq. It has also a group in I mean, there are some people who say that there are affiliates or groups that are supportive of Al-Qaeda in Syria. I think there's a question mark about that. Certainly in Saudi Arabia, it still has supporters. And so it does have a number of affiliates around the world.
There are reports that Khalid Mohammed was in Brazil and Paraguay, that there are sleeper cells also in South America. Have you heard about that?
I mean, I have heard that there is the possibility of sleeper cells in South America. My view is that just like in North America, they're not likely to be sleeper cells, but rather to be individuals who have decided to commit themselves to the cause of Al-Qaeda. If there had been sleeper cells in this region, I think we would have known about it in the last 10 years. I mean, they would have engaged in some sort of act of militancy in this period, and they haven't. I mean, or very few of them. In fact, very few sleeper cells per se have engaged in violence. You have always this lone wolf vigilante phenomenon that has taken place.
Does Al-Qaeda still have the capability to do big operations like 9/11 or the bombings in London and Madrid?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible to imagine that a group will get together and you know, 4 or 5 individuals who will simultaneously detonate suicide belts, you know, in an attack on a subway station or train and so on. 9/11 is another order, I think. You know, a coordinated attack with the hijacking of airplanes and so on. I think that's unlikely. But 3, 4, 5 individuals engaging in suicide attacks, that's possible.
There are reports that maybe they have smuggled a nuclear device into the U.S. or a dirty bomb. Have you heard of that?
I think this is, you know, pure speculation. I don't think that's likely. I suspect that, look, if Al-Qaeda had had a dirty bomb, nuclear or otherwise, I imagine they would have used it already.
What has Al-Qaeda gained and what has it lost in those last 10 years? And what is their perception of that?
Look, I think that Al-Qaeda has gained in one respect, which is the argument that they have made, which is America and the West is against Islam and that Islam is under threat by the West and that the West is the enemy of Islam. That argument, I think, they have won in the hearts and minds, in the battle for the hearts and minds of Muslims. Where they have not won is the tactical and strategic prescriptions and commands that they give, which is for Muslims to engage in private acts of violence against Westerners, to engage in terror attacks. There they have lost a tremendous amount. And they've lost largely because many of their attacks have been directed at other Muslims. And so the numerous suicide attacks that we have seen in Iraq, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, but also to a lesser extent in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, these have turned off many Arabs and Muslims. I mean, they have basically made people realize that Al-Qaeda's type of violence is not the kind of violence that ordinary Muslims want to be associated with. So in some ways they've won the big broad argument, but not the strategic and tactical argument about what to do in response to the attack of the West on Islam.
Has Al-Qaeda been defeated by the Arab Spring?
I think that the Arab Spring events have defeated Al-Qaeda in two very different ways. On the one hand, Al-Qaeda has always argued that the regimes of the Middle East, regimes like those in Egypt and Tunisia, can only be toppled through violence. The fact that mass peaceful mobilization through demonstrations have toppled these two regimes shows that Al-Qaeda was wrong about the necessity of violence for toppling regimes. The other way in which Al-Qaeda has been severely threatened by the uprisings of the Arab Spring is that the uprisings of the Arab Spring are calling for greater dignity, more accountability in governance, the ending of corruption, the individual, the importance that is placed on the individual. That, again, has been a defeat for Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda has not argued for the individual, has always argued for the nation of Islam, for the larger community of Islam. So the argument that is being made on the basis of individual rights as opposed to collective rights is also a defeat for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has reacted to the Arab Spring by saying, no, we agree with all these things as well, and please, keep doing what you're doing, and we will help you in every way we can, and so on. So they've tried to be parasites in that they've tried to say, we also agree with the same things. But it's clear that they are very disturbed by the rise of forces that are not sympathetic to its ideology in places like Egypt, Tunisia, maybe even Syria and Yemen.
What is their strategy now?
I don't know if they have a coordinated strategy. And the thing about Al-Qaeda is that they know one thing, which is that you want to bring change through radicalization and violence. I don't think they can reinvent themselves to come up with a new strategy.
So what will they do?
Well, hopefully, I think they will try. I mean, and their hope is that in places like Libya and in places like Syria and in places even like Egypt, that these revolutions will fail. They will bring on more authoritarian violence and repression, and that will give Al-Qaeda a new lease on life, that will revive the claims that Al-Qaeda has been making all along. So the failure of these revolutions will be, I think, a great victory for Al-Qaeda, because it will give them a new opportunity.
How was Al-Qaeda crushed in Saudi Arabia?
In Saudi Arabia, the crushing of Al-Qaeda was largely a security and military attack on all organized forms of Al-Qaeda presence. So there was a very hard, blunt instrument used against them, in combination with a set of policies that involved de-radicalization, offering jobs to militants, re-educating militants, finding brides and wives for the militants, so bringing the families on board, to use the family to make the militant become less radical. So it was a two-pronged sort of approach, a hard police security approach and an ideological indoctrination approach that seems to have worked.
There's a story of that prince that escaped a bombing. How was that?
The prince who has led the attack against Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia is a man who is the son of the Minister of the Interior of Saudi Arabia. His name is Mohammed bin Nayef. He's a prince who is basically a deputy Minister of the Interior and a fairly young man. And he has led this highly personal approach to bring Al-Qaeda members back and to offer them the possibility of reform and exoneration from their crimes that they've committed. And one young man came from Yemen and said to the prince, called him and said, I'm coming and I'm going to give up Al-Qaeda and I will accept this asylum agreement that you are offering. What happened was that the man was carrying a bomb inside him. He put a bomb inside him through his backside. And when he got, the prince even sent his plane, his private plane, to fly him into Jeddah. And when the young man showed up in the palace of the prince, he came up close to the prince and he detonated himself. He blew himself up. The prince was very slightly injured. Other people were more seriously injured. And the young man, of course, died. So it shows you, that episode shows you the limits of the politics of the personal that this Saudi prince has engaged in. And the prince himself was then rebuked by the king of Saudi Arabia, who told him that he had really done something that was too risky, and that he should not have done it.
Here in the U.S., people associate the Wahhabi theology of Saudi Arabia with Al-Qaeda as being the same thing.
No, Al-Qaeda is a combination of Muslim Brotherhood, radical Muslim Brotherhood ideology, and Wahhabi theology. So it's a combination, a confluence of two different streams of Islamic theological and religious and political thought. And most Wahhabis, a vast majority of Wahhabis are not violent, and they're not people who advocate the kind of violence that Al-Qaeda engages in. Al-Qaeda is really a splinter fringe movement that emerges out of the stream of these two larger movements, the Wahhabis and the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a new thing. I mean, it's a new phenomenon.
So the theology, the Wahhabi theology that Saudi Arabia funds is basically the same as Al-Qaeda's theology. But have they changed, the Saudis, have they changed their way of doing it after 9/11?
In Saudi Arabia, after 9/11, there was initially a state of denial, that we have nothing to do with this, these are not people that come out of our tradition. Then when the bombings, the suicide bombings and attacks started in 2003, there was a moment of recognition in Saudi Arabia that in fact this movement may have something to do with Wahhabism. And since 2003, the Saudis have argued that yes, some aspects or elements of Wahhabism have to be toned down or changed, that we have to produce a softer, milder version of Wahhabism, especially the elements in Wahhabism that treat other Muslims who are different from the Wahhabis as heretics. So they've tried with varying degrees of success, and not always successful, to reduce those elements of Wahhabism that look at other Muslims as heretics.
How has Al-Qaeda been defeated in Iraq?
Well, I mean, there's a question mark as to whether Al-Qaeda has been defeated in Iraq. I mean, Al-Qaeda does have a presence in Iraq, and it has been weakened. Let's say it's been weakened, not defeated, largely because at one point around 2006, 2007, a number of Sunnis in Iraq decided that Al-Qaeda was not helpful to the cause of the Sunnis. And so a number of these Sunnis were attracted by the Americans and by American money to form what are called awakening councils. So there was a new movement of these awakening councils among Sunnis who then were working with the Americans against Al-Qaeda, and they turned their attacks on Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda was very severely weakened as a result of this shift, a deliberate shift among Sunnis of Iraq against Al-Qaeda. Now, the money's later dried up, and so a number of these Sunnis appear to have switched back to a pro-Al-Qaeda stance. And now that some of the attacks that we still see in Iraq, of course much reduced, not as many as before, seem to have elements of Al-Qaeda ideology and tactics involved.
What will happen in Iraq after the Americans leave?
My sense is that Iraq is not in very good shape. I mean, the sectarian type of politics that dominates there, where one group dominates the country, the Shia, doesn't look good for Iraq. I think there's a lot of corruption in Iraq. There's a lot of Iranian meddling in Iraq, and you have a community that feels disenfranchised, the Sunnis. So, you know, I'm not very optimistic for Iraq, to be honest with you. Even now, before the Americans leave, because you don't really have a stable democratic order that has been established, but rather a sectarian and violent order.
So you think that violence could increase?
Probably. Especially if the countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran decide that they're going to fight a proxy war. If they decide to take out their rivalry, or to engage in a rivalry in other countries through proxies, Iraq would be a place where they might do this.
Will the Taliban be back in power after the Americans leave Afghanistan?
Yes, very likely, yes. I think that if the Americans were to leave today or tomorrow, the Taliban would come back to power, especially since they're backed by the Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis want Afghanistan. They want control over Afghanistan through a group like the Taliban.
In the US, we hear that the madrasas in Pakistan are forming new followers for Al-Qaeda. Is that true?
I think that the madrasas produce jihadis for the Taliban. I'm not sure that they produce jihadis for Al-Qaeda. Most Al-Qaeda recruits typically are not madrasa graduates. They tend to be middle class, Western educated, many of them, people. They're not sort of madrasa types, with few exceptions, of course.
Now in September, the UN likely will recognize a Palestinian state. What will happen after that?
Well, I think, I mean, if it's a vote in the General Assembly, a lot will depend on whether the United States votes for or against this resolution. If it is to come to the Security Council, which is unlikely, and the Americans were to veto it, then, you know, that would also be a signal that the United States is against Palestinian rights. So I think that the recognition of a Palestinian state is likely to increase tensions of the kind that we've already seen in the Middle East. Namely that, you know, the Palestinians are not given their rights, and that the United States has sided much more in the pro-Israeli camp than in the pro-Palestinian camp.
And then, what kind of outcome?
I don't think that I don't think that Israel is ready for making peace with the Palestinians. And as long as that's the case, I think we will see opportunities for more radicalization and more violence in the Arab world, and perhaps also especially amongst the Palestinians.
Looking forward, what do you think will be the situation in the Middle East? Because now we are in the middle of this revolution,
yes.
But a few months or a year from now.
I don't know. You know, to be honest with you, I think that anyone who can tell you that they know for sure what's going to happen in the Middle East is lying and doesn't know what they're talking about. I think that this upheaval that we're seeing with the Arab Spring revolutions is unprecedented, or at least we haven't seen it for at least 50, 60 years. And so the direction of these movements, whether they will end up producing accountable democratic governments, or whether they will lead to more authoritarianism or to civil war, is still unclear. I think we're in a period of great flux and change, and it's not clear at all what the outcome of these movements is likely to be.
President Obama went to Cairo, reached out for a dialogue with the Arab world. How has the Arab world seen that, this dialogue?
I think that the Arabs feel that President Obama talks very nicely, but doesn't follow up his talk with concrete policies. Now, that image has changed slightly because he has supported the revolution in Egypt finally. But on one of the core issues in the Middle East, namely the Arab-Israeli conflict, President Obama has not pushed Israel hard enough to reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians. And I think many Arabs and Muslims will wait to see whether Obama is willing to move in that direction before they decide on whether he's sincere or not.
What has the U.S. learned from 9/11?
Well, I mean, I think that as far as 9/11 is concerned, the most important lesson, and this is something that the Minister of Defense here, you know, the Secretary of Defense seems to have learned, which is that to engage in wars in the Middle East without a specific outcome and a well planned out, you know, policy is crazy. You know, so hopefully America won't invade countries like Iraq again on the pretext of 9/11. So hopefully this will spell a period of more isolation, less militarism in the United States. As to other lessons about 9/11, yes, certainly, I mean, the Americans are more security conscious. I don't think it's possible to have another 9/11 using airplanes, for instance, but, you know, perhaps using railroads or other forms of transportation, it will be possible to have something like that. But hopefully the most important lesson for the United States is that you really have to live in a world in which terror exists, and you have to come to a fine balance between liberties, especially domestic civil liberties, and an obsessively security conscious set of policies that will strip you of your domestic civil liberties. And I think that's a balance that's still being worked out in the United States.
When I'm asked about myself, I'm always repeating, I'm Egyptian by memory, I'm Swiss by nationality, Muslim by religion, European by culture, and universalistic by principles.